Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take a complex stack of maps, historical accounts, and cutting-edge science, and really distill them down into the knowledge you need to be truly well-informed.
Today, we are tracing the lineage of a single world-changing technology. And just think about it for a second. A simple needle rubbed with a magnet you can literally dig out of the ground, and then you float it in a bowl of water.
So simple.
That one tiny concept, the compass, it didn't just help ships sail farther. It fundamentally dictated the course of human history. It reshaped global power, trade, and even how we understand the physics of our own planet.
It really is a story of magnificent ingenuity, but also, just persistent frustration. For thousands of years, if you were a sailor bold enough to go out of sight of land, you were completely at the mercy of the sky.
The sun and the stars, yeah.
The Vikings, for example, they famously used instruments that relied on the position of the sun and, of course, the North Star for navigation.
And that reliance was so incredibly fragile, wasn't it? A bit of cloud coverage, some fog, or just being in the wrong season for good star sighting.
And that lifeline is just gone instantly.
It's cut. And navigators were left with, well, guesswork. They were using dead reckoning, calculating your position based on how long you've been sailing and your best guess at your speed.
Which is notoriously inaccurate over long distances.
Exactly. The magnetic needle just changed that entire equation. It offered a reliable, visible reference point that was totally independent of what the sky was doing.
But, and this is the big but, the magnetic field is a liar, as history will show us. It forced humanity to become, I guess, cartographers of an invisible force.
That's a great way to put it.
Our mission today is a deep dive into this entire lineage. We're going to trace the compass's journey from an ancient, almost spiritual tool to its role today as an absolutely essential and legally mandated backup for everything from supertankers to modern fighter jets.
And crucially, we're going to pay really close attention to those tricky scientific challenges, the problems that navigators and physicists and mathematicians had to solve over centuries. It was a constant battle against the Earth's own quirks and eventually the very materials we use to build our ships.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's so tempting to think of the compass as, a purely nautical invention, something for sailors. But the story begins much, much earlier, and in a completely different context.
That's right. The whole story starts in China, not for crossing oceans, but for spiritual alignment, for what's known as divination or geomancy.
And this goes way back, right?
Oh, way back. We're talking as early as Chinese Han Dynasty, so maybe around 300 to 200 BC.
And the key piece of technology, the foundation for all of this, was a mineral called lodestone.
Lodestone, yeah. It's a naturally occurring magnetic iron ore. Magnetite is the mineral name. It's one of the very few things you can find in nature that is just permanently magnetized.
So it doesn't need to be artificially charged or anything. You just dig it up and it points.
It just points. And the Chinese were the first to really harness this property.
And they used it for feng shui. So the art of placement, of making sure everything is in harmony with, I guess, natural forces. Why was knowing the exact cardinal direction so important for them?
Well, it was all about creating a microcosm that was perfectly aligned with the universe. The Chinese worldview really emphasized that human dwellings, graves, temples, all of it had to be aligned with what they saw as favorable cosmic energy flows.
So you needed a tool to measure that alignment.
And you needed a precise one. The early compass, which was known as a dipan, was an incredibly elaborate instrument. It was so much more than just a needle pointing north.
So tell me about this dipan. What was on it? What did it actually measure?
Well, you have to picture this complex scientific diagram. At the center, you'd often have a rotating lodestone spoon, which was called the sinan.
A spoon?
A spoon, yeah. It was carved so the handle would point. It was placed in the central indentation called the tianpan, which represented the heavens, the celestial sphere. But it was the rings around it that were just packed with information. They combined directional, temporal, and spiritual concepts all into one device.
I understand it pulled in elements from some of the most ancient Chinese texts, like the I Ching.
Exactly. The markings included the 8 trigrams, the bagua, which are these fundamental symbols for things like heaven, earth, fire, water. They also had the 24 directions, which were based on specific constellations, and the 28 lunar mansions, which were used to track the moon's position.
So a geomancer was using this to compare the magnetic forces of the local Earth with the, known geometry of the heavens and the patterns of time.
That's it, exactly. It was a timekeeping device, a spiritual alignment tool, and a geographic positioning system all rolled into one. It was science, theology, and urban planning in a single object.
Incredible. And it's just a long time to get from that philosophical tool to something you'd use on a ship.
Centuries. It was the Song Dynasty Chinese around the 11th century who finally adapted the technology for wide-scale marine use.
So what was that tipping point? What finally convinced a sailor that this spiritual thing was actually practical for crossing an ocean?
It was reliability when you couldn't see anything else. The earliest explicit record we have of it being used for navigation is this really critical historical moment. It's in a book by Zhu Yu called Ping Chao Table Talks, written between 1111 and 1117.
What did he say?
He noted that pilots, they used the stars or the sun for steering, which was totally standard. But then he adds this crucial line, in dark weather, they look at the south-pointing needle.
That's the key. When everything else fails, you look at the needle.
That's the backup. And you mentioned it was a south-pointing needle, which is important because the Chinese primarily oriented themselves towards the south. It was the direction of warmth, the direction of the emperor.
And what did these early maritime versions look like? Were they still using a spoon?
Not usually, no. They moved to a wet compass idea. It was a magnetized needle. Sometimes they'd even shape it like a little fish or a turtle, and they'd float it in a bowl of water. They called it a south governor.
And the water would keep it stable.
Yeah, the water damps the movement of the needle. It stops it from swinging around wildly on a rocking ship, which gave you a much more stable reading. Hashtag 1.2, global diffusion and impact on shipbuilding. And a technology this useful, well, is never going to stay in one place for long. It's spread along the Silk Road, through the maritime trade routes, and into the burgeoning Islamic world.
And when do we start seeing it pop up in the West?
Historians generally agree on the path. The Chinese introduced it to Muslim traders and scholars who were masters of cartography and math. And from there, that knowledge was transferred into Western Europe. It appears in both places, the Islamic world and Europe, around the same time. We're talking circa 1190.
And the Islamic world, which was already at the forefront of astronomy, they just grabbed it and ran with it.
Oh, absolutely. It served two purposes for them. It was a huge aid for navigation, of course, but it was also quickly integrated into their scientific and religious life. Specifically, they used it as a Qibla indicator to help find the direction to Mecca for daily prayers.
So it's that same kind of integration of the practical and the cosmological that the Chinese had done centuries earlier.
It is, but it's also important to remember the compass didn't arrive in a vacuum. China was already a world leader in the other technologies you need to actually make long-distance sea travel possible.
Right. A compass is useless if your ship can't handle the open ocean.
And Song Dynasty shipbuilding was miles ahead of Europe at the time. They pioneered these huge structural innovations that made massive ocean-going ships safer and more efficient. Two big ones stand out: watertight bulkheads and the stern-mounted rudder.
Okay, so watertight bulkheads, that's basically creating separate compartments in the hull, right?
Wow.
It makes a ship much harder to sink.
Exactly. If one compartment gets breached and floods, the others stay dry. It massively improves buoyancy and saves the ship, the cargo, and the crew.
And the stern-mounted rudder.
That was a huge leap in steering. Before that, you had these clunky side rudders. A stern-mounted rudder is on the back of the hull, and you can even raise or lower it depending on the water depth. It gave you far, far superior control.
And these technologies, like the rudder, often traveled west through Muslim mariners before Europe adopted them. So by the time the compass shows up in Europe, the ships are just getting sophisticated enough to really take advantage of it.
That's the perfect context. The compass's arrival in Europe was a revolution. Before it, navigation was risky, seasonal. You mostly sailed in the fairer months when you could see the stars. The compass allowed for reliable, year-round maritime travel, and that just fundamentally changes the scale of trade and logistics.
And then around 1300, we start to see the dry-mounted compass becoming popular in Europe.
Yeah.
So a needle suspended on a pivot.
Yeah, and that gets perfected over time. People like Flavio Gioia are credited with enclosing the whole thing in a little glass-covered box. He really ruggedized it and standardized it, turning it into the sailor's tool we'd recognize today. Hashtag 1.3. The catalyst for the age of exploration, 15th, 17th century.
Okay, so by the 15th century, the Europeans have the ships, they have the rudders, they have the compass.
Yeah.
But what was the push? What compelled them to undertake these massive, incredibly risky ventures that we now call the age of exploration?
It was ambition, for sure, but the main drivers were economics and geopolitics. Two huge events happened in 1453 that made finding new sea routes to India and the East an absolute economic emergency for European powers.
The first one was the end of a lot of internal conflict.
Exactly. The Hundred Years' War finally ends, and that frees up this immense amount of resources in England and France, money, manpower, ships, that can now be pointed outwards instead of at each other.
But the second event was the real catalyst.
It was the big one, the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire.
And that one event basically choked off the established overland trade routes. The Silk Road, the path for all the spices, silks, and other luxury goods from the East.
It slammed the door shut. Suddenly, the price of these goods in Europe just skyrocketed, and the Europeans realized they needed a bypass. They needed a direct sea route that went around the Ottoman-controlled choke point.
So they pour everything they have into exploration from about 1450 to 1648.
Everything. And this whole expansion rested almost entirely on them adapting and perfecting these foreign technologies. You had the astrolabe, the stern-mounted rudder, and of course the magnetic compass.
You see the results almost immediately, right? Portugal starts pushing aggressively down the coast of Africa. King Afonso V commissions the From Mauro map in 1459, and he specifically uses Genoese navigators with their compasses to find these new routes.
And the result of all that technological mastery was the rapid rise of these huge maritime empires. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, the Dutch, ships like the caravel and the galleon, paired with the reliability of the compass, let them project their economic and military power across the entire globe.
And as our research details, the consequences of mastering the seas were, well, they were profound, they were permanent, and often they were devastating.
Absolutely. The geopolitical consequence was this massive shift of economic power. It moves away from the old Mediterranean trading states like Venice and Genoa and moves to the Atlantic states, Portugal, Spain, and later England and the Netherlands.
And globally, it creates these vast interconnected trade networks like the Columbian Exchange.
It does. But that shift also fueled the massive expansion of the African slave trade to finance the new plantation economies in the Americas. And it led to these profound demographic catastrophes for indigenous populations because of the introduction of European diseases. That simple magnetic needle, which started its life as a tool for spiritual alignment, ultimately enabled the construction of a new, globally interconnected and tragically unbalanced world order.
So by the 15th century, Europeans have the compass. They're using it. But as soon as they venture out into the open Atlantic, a new, really fundamental problem comes up. The compass, this thing that was supposed to be their perfect guide, starts lying to them.
Yeah. And that's because the Earth, as a magnetic entity, is not neat and tidy. The moment they sailed long distances, navigators realized the needle didn't actually point where they thought it should point. It wasn't pointing to true north. Hashtag 2.1, true north versus magnetic north. Very easy.
Let's nail down these definitions because this is critical. A compass needle aligns itself with the horizontal component of the Earth's magnetic field. It points to magnetic north.
Correct. But magnetic north is not true north. True north is the geographic North Pole. It's the fixed point of the Earth's rotational axis. And the magnetic North Pole, well, it's a moving target, and it's currently about 1,000 miles away from the geographic North Pole.
Wow. 1,000 miles. So that spatial separation creates the first core problem for navigation. Magnetic variation, or as it's also called, declination.
Variation is simply the angle between true north and magnetic north. And the crucial maddening part is that this angle changes drastically depending on where you are on the globe.
And this must have caused absolute panic for early navigators. I mean, Columbus famously noticed this, right?
He did. As he crossed the Atlantic, he saw the compass needle was pointing more and more to the west of where the North Star told him true north was. His crew, seeing this, grew terrified. They thought the laws of nature themselves were breaking down out in the middle of the ocean.
So the immediate scientific challenge became not just using the compass, but fixing it by mapping this invisible global force.
Absolutely. And it forced a deep dive into geophysics. Early theories were, well, they were pretty fanciful. Some thought the needle pointed to a giant mountain of lodestone up in the Arctic. That was dispelled by a guy named Robert Norman in 1581, who figured out that the source of the magnetic force, the point of respect as he called it, had to be inside the Earth itself.
And that leads to pioneers like Dr. William Gilbert, who started modeling the Earth as a giant magnet using little spherical lodestones.
He was on the right track. But the really tricky part was that the magnetic map was a moving target. In 1635, an English mathematician, Henry Gellibrand, discovered what we call Secular variation.
Secular variation.
It means the magnetic field itself changes slowly over time. The whole field drifts. This is caused by the swirling electrical currents in the Earth's hot, liquid outer core. So your magnetic map from 10 years ago might be dangerously wrong today.
So you need continuous, regular updates. This required dedicated, state-sponsored science.
It did. And Halley's voyages in the late 17th century are the perfect example.
Edmund Halley, of Halley's Comet fame.
The very same.
Yeah.
He commanded a ship called the Paramour on 2 voyages, specifically to gather magnetic declination data from all over the world's oceans. His work led to this incredible map in 1701 that introduced isogons.
Isogons. So that's a line connecting all the points on Earth that have the same magnetic variation.
Exactly. It was a radical visualization of an invisible field. It was the first map of its kind to survive, and mariners, including Captain James Cook, depended heavily on copies of Halley's map.
And having this map finally allowed sailors to apply the necessary correction on the fly. You, the navigator, you look at your nautical chart, it tells you the local variation, and it even tells you the annual rate of change.
And that leads us to the core equation that defined centuries of navigation. It's true course equals magnetic course plus variation, or TCIA-MC plus VAR.
So the direction you actually want to go, your true course, is what you get after you take the course your compass is showing you, the magnetic course, and you correct it for that geographic variation.
That's the whole job.
Yeah.
And the math convention is that west variations are negative and east variations are positive. That's because the compass card is marked clockwise.
Okay, so let's walk through a quick example to make that concrete.
Yep.
Let's say I want to steer a true course of 090 degrees, so exactly east.
Okay.
I'll look at my chart, and it says the magnetic variation in my area is 10 degrees west.
So variation is minus 10. You plug that into the equation. 90 equals MC plus negative 10.
So to find the magnetic course I need to steer, I have to add 10 to 90.
Exactly. The magnetic course you need to steer on your compass is 100 degrees. The compass needle is being pulled 10 degrees too far to the west, so you have to steer 10 degrees further east on the compass dial to actually go east.
And if I just steered 090 on the compass,
You'd actually be sailing on a true course of 80 degrees. You'd be off by 10 degrees, which, over a long voyage, is a disaster. The navigator's job was to constantly solve that dynamic equation, hashtag tag 2.2, ship interference, deviation, and compensation.
so once they mapped the entire world and understood variation, was the compass finally perfect?
Not even close. Unfortunately, no, because the moment humanity started building ships out of iron and steel, they introduced an entirely new and frankly even more complex source of error, and this one came from inside the vessel. It's called magnetic deviation.
Okay, so deviation. This is the angle between the compass needle and magnetic north that's caused by the ship's own stuff. The steel hull, anchors, engines, electrical wiring.
All of it. Anything iron or anything with an electrical current creates its own local magnetic field. The problem was first noticed way back in 1538 by a Portuguese explorer, Rui Castro. He noted the effect of the proximity of artillery pieces, anchors, and other iron on his compass.
But it must have gone from being a minor annoyance to a huge problem in the 19th century with all steel ships.
It became a catastrophic error source. The total compass error is the sum of that external geographic variation and this internal ship-based deviation. And the worst part is, deviation changes every time the ship changes its heading.
So you can't just fix it with a static chart like you can with variation.
It's a dynamic moving target unique to every single ship. This led to a huge effort in mathematical analysis. A major breakthrough was Archibald Smith's formula in the mid-19th century. He came up with this practical, if he called it inexact, equation that allowed navies to figure out a ship's unique magnetic signature.
And they could use that to create a deviation card for their specific ship, right?
Yeah.
Listing the error for every possible heading.
Exactly. But there were even more specialized errors, things like heeling error and retentive error.
Okay, what's heeling error?
That's when the ship leans or heels over because of wind or waves. When that happens, the vertical parts of the ship's magnetic field start to influence the horizontal compass needle. And that effect is at its worst when you're heading north or south.
And retentive error, that sounds tricky.
It's very tricky. That's where the ship's hard iron actually holds on to a residual magnetic charge after you've been on a set course for a long time. The ship essentially remembers its last magnetic alignment, and it takes a while for that to fade. Dealing with that required what skilled navigators called a good bit of art.
So since all this calculation was so complex and prone to, just getting a plus or minus sign wrong, they started using physical compensation. which sounds wonderfully ironic.
Mhm.
You're adding more metal to the compass area to counteract the effect of all the other metal.
It is entirely counterintuitive, but it was absolutely necessary. The whole process is called swinging the compass.
And how does that work?
You take the ship out to a known location and you rotate it slowly through 360 degrees. As you turn, the crew notes the compass readings and compares them to known fixed points on shore. They measure the deviation at, say, 8 or 32 different directions around the compass, which are called rums.
And the compensation equipment itself is housed in the binnacle. That's the pedestal the compass sits on. How do they physically cancel out these magnetic fields?
It's a three-pronged approach. First, you use small permanent magnets that you insert into the binnacle to compensate for the ship's permanent magnetism and the fixed magnetic charge of the hull itself.
Okay.
Second, to counter the effects of vertical magnetism, you install the Flinders bar.
The Flinders bar is this fascinating piece of equipment. I've seen them on old ships. It's a vertical iron bar, right?
It is. It's a vertical, soft iron bar, usually inside a brass tube, right next to the compass. It's designed to create an equal and opposite magnetic field to the one created by vertical iron on the ship, like funnels or masts. It passively neutralizes that field.
And then finally, you have those famous spheres you see on either side of the binnacle.
Those are soft iron spheres. They correct for something called quadrantal forces. That's induced magnetism that messes with the compass 4 times as the ship turns a full circle. You mount them on either side, and the whole process is trial and error. You swing the ship, adjust the magnets, adjust the spheres, adjust the Flinders bar, until you get the total deviation down to a manageable minimum. Hashtag 2.3, operational magnetic limits and modern types.
But even with a perfectly compensated compass, free of variation and deviation errors, it still has limits imposed by the Earth's geometry. What happens when you get too close to the magnetic poles?
That's when you run into the problem of magnetic dip, or inclination. If you imagine the Earth's magnetic field lines, they come out of the South Pole and loop around and plunge back into the North Pole.
So near the equator, those lines are mostly horizontal, parallel to the surface.
Exactly. But as you get closer and closer to a magnetic pole, those lines become more and more vertical. They start pointing straight down into the ground.
And a compass needle is designed to swing horizontally, so if the force is pulling it vertically,
It stops working. The needle starts to dip, pointing up or down, and it becomes completely useless for steering. In fact, even in moderate latitudes in the northern hemisphere, they have to put a tiny weight on the southern end of the compass needle just to counteract that natural downward pull and keep it level.
So the magnetic compass is simply not a primary navigation tool in polar regions.
No, not at all. That's why polar explorers had to rely on celestial navigation and later on the gyrocompass.
We've also seen the instrument itself evolve over time, from that early dry compass to the liquid compass. How big of a deal was that liquid innovation?
It was huge. A dry compass, just a needle and a sharp pivot. It swings around like crazy in heavy seas. It's very hard to get a stable reading. The liquid compass, where the card and the needle are suspended in a fluid like kerosene or alcohol, it damps all that oscillation. It gives you a much, much more stable and accurate reading. That stability basically made the dry compass obsolete by the end of the 19th century.
And on land, the compass transformed into this precise tool for map reading and, for recreation.
Yeah, that's the protractor or baseplate compass. It was developed by a man named Gunnar Tillander in 1928 specifically for the sport of orienteering. It combines the magnetic needle with a clear, transparent baseplate that has orienting lines and a direction of travel arrow.
So you don't need a separate protractor. You can take a bearing directly from a map.
It made it incredibly fast and efficient, and modern versions use these powerful rare earth magnets that let the needle settle in less than a second. They're perfect for fast-paced land navigation.
Okay, so we've established that the magnetic compass, even when it was perfectly compensated, was always fighting these two uphill battles. You had the shifting geography of the planet, which is variation, and then you had the growing mass of magnetic interference inside the ship, which is deviation.
And by the late 19th century, with the invention of these massive all-steel battleships, and especially with the critical need for precise navigation in new environments like submarines, the magnetic compass just hit a hard wall. The amount of steel and complex electrical systems made the deviation so large and unpredictable that it was just too dangerous to rely on for primary navigation. Hashtag 3.1. The need for true north.
So the solution was revolutionary. It was to abandon magnetism entirely, and instead to harness the rotational physics of the Earth itself. And this brings us to the gyroscope.
The gyroscope is the key. It was first built for scientific use by Léon Foucault back in 1852, and the fundamental principle behind it is the conservation of angular momentum.
Okay, so like a spinning top.
Exactly like a spinning top. If you have a spinning wheel in space, it will try to maintain its original orientation relative to the stars, no matter what the Earth is doing underneath it. To someone standing on the rotating Earth, that gyroscope's axis would seem to drift or precess, completing a full circle every 24 hours.
So a simple gyroscope is a good heading indicator. It tells you where you were pointed, but it's not pointing to true north. The real genius was converting that gyroscope into a gyrocompass.
That was the crucial step. It required a mechanism that could sense gravity and apply a torque, a turning force, to force the gyroscope's axis to align itself with the Earth's rotational axis.
This is like the highly sophisticated motorized pendulum.
That's a great analogy. The way it works practically is you put the spinning gyro inside a special gimbal mounting, and that mounting is constrained, usually by weights, to stay horizontal to the Earth's surface. So as the Earth rotates, the combination of the gyro's desire to stay fixed in space and the constant pull of gravity creates a force that nudges the gyro's axis back towards the true North Pole.
It's effectively using the Earth's own rotation as its reference point.
That's it. So the magnetic compass aligns with a dynamic physical field, but the gyrocompass aligns with a fixed mathematical concept, the Earth's rotational axis.
Which means it's totally independent of magnetic interference, steel hulls, electrical currents.
And most importantly, it points directly to true north. It solves the centuries-old problem of variation in a single stroke. Hashtag 3.2. The Sperry and Einstein-Kampfer rivalry. And the race to turn this physics concept into a practical industrial device led to this incredible technological arms race between two fierce competitors at the turn of the 20th century.
In Germany, you had Dr. Hermann Einstein-Kampfer. He was the first one to develop a really usable, practical gyrocompass back in 1906.
Yeah, Einstein was driven by the German Admiralty. They desperately needed a reliable navigation system for their new submarine fleet. His original design was quickly mass-produced by his company.
And then on the other side of the Atlantic, you have the American inventor Elmer Sperry, who develops his own version starting around 1909.
And their rivalry was just intense. It sparked these long, incredibly complex international patent disputes. The battle even dragged in Albert Einstein.
Albert Einstein?
Yeah, he was called in as an expert witness to provide opinions on the technical differences between the two systems for the legal proceedings.
Wow. So what were the key design differences that drove this whole rivalry?
Sperry's design was mechanically more complex, but it offered much better automation. He used a different arrangement of gyros, and he incorporated this crucial feature: a sophisticated servo feedback system and an internal analog computer.
An analog computer inside the compass.
Exactly. This little computer was constantly calculating and applying corrections for the ship's speed and its latitude, which made the system largely automated and self-correcting.
Which is why the Sperry system was so widely adopted by surface navies, who really valued that automation and speed.
Precisely. Einstein-Kampfer's design, while it needed more manual attention, had two huge advantages for submarines. It used less power, and critically, it generated less noise. For a sub trying to operate silently, minimizing noise was everything. So Einstein became the preferred choice for the U-boat fleets.
And the immediate impact of the gyrocompass, arriving just before World War I, it just can't be overstated, can it?
It was a complete game changer. For the very first time, large warships could navigate and, just as importantly, target their weapons based on reliable true north readings, totally unaffected by their massive steel hulls or their powerful engines.
And it was quickly adopted for civilian use, too.
Oh yeah, a company called Seaplath installed the first gyrocompass on a commercial vessel in 1913. The revolution was underway.
As the technology matured, physicists found even more subtle complexities, leading to these concepts that sound like science fiction, like something called Schuller tuning.
Schuller tuning is just a brilliant piece of applied physics. It was identified by Max Schuller in 1923, and it addresses a fundamental problem. If a ship accelerates or changes latitude, the gyrocompass experiences these disturbing forces that can pull it off true north.
Okay.
Schuller realized that if you could design the gyrocompass to have a natural oscillation period of exactly 84.4 minutes, it would become insensitive to that lateral motion.
Why 84.4 minutes? That's so specific.
It's the orbital period of a conceptual satellite orbiting the Earth at sea level. By tuning the gyrocompass to match this global rhythm, you essentially make it behave like a giant pendulum whose period is the same as the Earth's radius. It makes it immune to the small deviations caused by the ship's own movement. It's this beautiful mathematical link between the ship, gravity, and the Earth's circumference. Hashtag 3.3 WWII applications and preservation.
So by World War II, the gyrocompass wasn't just a navigation tool anymore. It was a core part of fire control systems, especially on submarines.
Submarines relied on extremely accurate heading data to calculate their torpedo solutions. You're trying to hit a moving target from a moving platform while you're completely blind underwater.
Right.
Systems like the ARMA Corporation Mark 7 gyrocompass were vital. They provided the foundational true course data that these early analog fire control computers needed to make an accurate shot.
And there's a powerful historical example of this vanishing technology on the USS Pampanito, which was a Blau-class submarine from 1943.
Yeah, the Pampanito is a museum ship now in San Francisco, and it still has its original WWII RRMA Mark 7 gyrocompass. And the museum has made restoring this machine to full operational condition a major goal. And this effort highlights a really fascinating point about preserving old technology.
Why is it so important to actually operate the equipment instead of just having it as a static display?
Well, our research points to a few vital reasons. First, complex machinery that sits idle actually deteriorates faster than equipment that's operated. Running the system distributes lubrication, it dries out components, heat cycles prevent moisture damage. The machine itself is just healthier when it's used.
Okay, that makes sense.
But maybe more importantly, operating the system preserves the institutional knowledge. It preserves the human technical skills required to maintain it.
You mean the vanishing craft of servicing these intricate mechanical computers?
Exactly. Setting up the delicate rotor mechanism, the sensitive element, that's a highly specialized multi-day job. The restoration effort is literally a race against time. They need specialized parts, like period-correct motor generators and amplifiers, and crucially, they need the skilled labor, often retired Navy chief petty officers who still have the knowledge to fix these things before that entire generation is gone. Maintaining the machine preserves the history of the human interaction with the technology.
So we went from magnetic needles to these complex mechanical gyroscopes that harness the rotation of the planet. But since World War II, we've just leapfrogged into the digital age. What is navigating a modern ship or aircraft like now in the era of satellites?
Well, we've moved from physical alignment to electronic sensing and global satellite triangulation. The new systems are vastly more accurate, but they come with a whole new set of dependencies and vulnerabilities. Hashtag 4.1, the shift to electronic and satellite systems.
So the first major successor to the traditional magnetic compass was the solid-state electronic compass, or e-compass.
Right. These are small, they use solid-state magnetometers on 3 axes, and they give you a fast digital heading. They sense the Earth's magnetic field electronically, but while they're convenient, they share the magnetic compass's core weakness.
They're still susceptible to local magnetic fields.
Highly susceptible. They're very prone to noise from electric motors, power lines, all the electronic clutter in a modern vehicle. They need constant, sophisticated internal algorithms and filtering just to stay accurate.
And then came the real revolution, the GPS compass. And this system ignores magnetism completely.
The GPS compass is an incredible piece of tech. It determines your heading by comparing the phase differences of signals it receives from multiple GPS satellites. It uses at least 2 antennas mounted a short distance apart on the vessel.
So it's not detecting magnetism, it's measuring tiny time differences in the arrival of satellite signals across that fixed baseline.
That's it. And that makes it superior to the e-compass because it's completely immune to the ship's own magnetic environment.
But there's always a but.
There's always a but. The primary advantage is its extremely high accuracy and independence from magnetism. The critical limitation, however, is that it relies entirely on those satellite signals.
Which can be blocked or jammed.
Exactly. If the signals are blocked by, say, tall buildings in a harbor, a deep canyon, or if they're intentionally jammed by an adversary, the system is instantly and completely useless.
So modern navigation in a big commercial ship or a high-end aircraft, it's really a hybrid approach. You have the gyrocompass providing true north, GPS providing position, and all these other electronic sensors monitoring movement.
It's a fusion of systems. The new complex systems handle the primary navigation with staggering accuracy, but they are all inherently dependent on external power, complex internal computers, and those fragile satellite signals. And that is why the ultimate safety net is often the most technologically primitive device on board. Hashtag 4.2, the enduring magnetic lifeline.
It's amazing. Despite the incredible accuracy of GPS, the old-fashioned magnetic compass is still widely used and critically legally mandated for safety in virtually all modes of global transport.
So why does this ancient technology hold on to its status as the supreme directional backup?
It comes down to three immutable core strengths: simplicity, reliability, and independence. It requires zero external power. It requires zero external signal.
If every satellite in the sky falls, if the ship's batteries die, if the computer crashes, if every single wire is cut, that magnetic needle will still align itself with the planet's magnetic field. It is a completely self-contained, analog, physical system.
So the legal requirement for a backup is basically an admission that our complex, hyperdigital systems are fundamentally fallible.
Absolutely. International maritime regulations, national aviation regulations, they all enforce its use. For instance, in the US, federal regulations mandate that all aircraft must be equipped with a magnetic compass. It's the final, unpowered analog safety net. In the event of a total system failure or a sophisticated GPS jamming attack, the magnetic needle is the ultimate directional tool.
Are there any advancements still being made to this simple design today?
Well, the fundamental principle is unchanged, but there are utility improvements. For example, some modern military compasses incorporate phosphors mixed with the radioactive isotope tritium
For illumination.
for self-luminous illumination, yeah. The compass glows in the dark without needing to be charged by a light source. The only patch is that tritium has a half-life of only about 12 years, so the glow fades noticeably over time, and the compass has to be refurbished or replaced.
But whether it's a dry-mounted compass in a World War II submarine or a tritium-illuminated backup in a modern fighter jet, the core idea is exactly the same. It's a magnetized needle, seeking alignment with the Earth's field, serving as our essential, independent directional lifeline. Hashtag chagged outro. This has been a really remarkable journey, tracing directional knowledge from a spoon-shaped piece of lodestone used for ancient Chinese geomancy all the way to a piece of mandated emergency equipment in every modern cockpit and on every ship's bridge worldwide.
It really has. And we've seen that the history of navigation is this story of continuous scientific struggle. We first had to discover the secrets of the Earth's magnetic field, that geographic misalignment we call variation.
And then we had to mitigate the imperfections of our own vehicles, that ship-induced interference known as deviation.
And that difficult, centuries-long effort eventually led us to bypass magnetism altogether by harnessing rotational physics in the gyrocompass. That let us reliably track true north for the very first time, independent of metal or electricity.
And yet, despite the phenomenal power of GPS and all these electronic systems, the humble magnetic compass remains the mandatory failsafe.
It requires zero power, zero external signal, and zero computer processing. That makes it the final safety net protecting global transport from a total directional system failure.
So what does this centuries-long battle with the Earth's magnetic field mean for our future? Especially when you consider the natural forces we still can't fully control.
Well, we talked about Henry Gellibrand's discovery back in 1635. The Earth's magnetic field changes over time, that secular variation. We know from geologic records and current measurements that this field continues to weaken. If that weakening leads to a geomagnetic reversal event where the magnetic poles flip entirely, which is a natural event that has happened many, many times in deep history.
What happens to our legally mandated magnetic compass backup?
Exactly. It raises this fundamental physical question about safety in a world that's becoming hyperdigital and globally interconnected, where our final ultimate safety mechanism relies on a force that is destined to, at some point, periodically disappear or reverse direction entirely.